Hello and welcome to week 6 in behavior management here. And chapter 6, defining behaviors. Now, what we've been doing last week, we looked at the A's. We're going to look at the B's. We look at the A's over 2 weeks, looking both at communication and environmental influence, because you're really talking about everything that's occurred up until the point at which the person needs to make a decision on their behavior, including personal history, culture, all of that stuff is part of the A. We don't necessarily encapsulate that, but we definitely take it into consideration when we're dealing with someone, defining the A's. Now, the B's is when we look at actually defining what is it that we want to see? What is the behavior? Remember, this is the applied behavior analysis. All the stuff before was just looking at how ABCs exist within the world. Now we're looking at when we want to purposefully use this particular tools in order to manage someone's behavior or manage our own behavior. We need to go into really carefully defining what we mean by the behavior that we're looking at. There's lots of problems associated with how individuals who have not had the benefit of this class or don't remember what they learned in this class and have created behavior plans that really fail, not because behavior management fails. Remember, behavior management is based on one of the very few laws within the field of psychology. Lots of other theories are just theories, like maybe this is how it's going to turn out. This one is its power and its utility all comes from the fact that it stems from this principle of human behavior that seems to be at the level of law. So oftentimes when we do a behavior plan and it doesn't work, now humanly we might say, well, behavior management doesn't work. I'll say as a behavior manager, I would say the problem is most likely in the way an individual has defined the A, B's, and the C's. And B, all of them are important, but we're going to spend some time looking at B's because that is often the source of the problem. Probably more so than the other, they're all important, and I hate to kind of like prioritize one because they're a team, they all work together, but nonetheless. So I have encountered in the real world, these are behavior plans within group homes, within halfway houses, within education settings and whatnot, that you have this plan that's been put together and the behavior is not even identified. There's no clear definition for the behavior. We'll do better in school. That kind of like, what is that? There's a million ways to define what we'll do better in school, and we'll take a look at those. Um, how we break those down into specific behaviors, but that's just way that you haven't defined a behavior. Doing better in school is the result. It's actually a long-term consequence of a whole set of behaviors, like doing homework and doing all that. Sometimes there's a behavior that's identified, but it's not clear enough. We'll look at some examples of that. And then, it's partially why we see individuals interpret behavior management as a response to negative behavior by the use of punishment. And that is when we define the behavior that we identify is that they refrain from something. Like, and you can see where that turns into a punishment. What we're saying is like, if you don't hit your brother, you'll get an ice cream. I'll put the A in there. All morning, if you go all morning without hitting your brother, I will give you some ice cream. The not behaviors, although those kinds of plans sometimes work, depends on how bad they want ice cream. It depends on some other factors that we'll look at in just a minute. as I refer to the behavior vacuum that creates, a phrase for you to think about, those often don't work because the not behaviors doesn't tell you what to do instead. So as we are applying the science of behavior management, you can do not behavior plans all you want. You can do, don't do this and you'll get this. Don't do that. Don't, knock yourselves out. But if you're going to apply the science of this, you want to avoid those. And I'll tell you why. Now, we also have the tendency to focus on the results. The one that I just said, will do well in school. We see that as a behavior, but it's not. It's the consequence of behaviors, and we are putting the consequence in as the behavior. Like doing well in school becomes the behavior, and then there's some mysterious what does that mean? I mean, even that in our society, we're looking at there's actually fairly good evidence that you can do really well in school and you're not guaranteed necessarily to get a good job or anything like that. So the doing well in school is not a behavior. It's the result of behaviors. And when we focus on results, we are, again, instead of focusing on the behavior, when we're focusing on the results, our plans will tend to fail. That is why almost every single weight management program fails. It's a bad behavior plan. So if ultimately you're saying, I want to lose 15 pounds in the next month, that's not a behavior. That's the result of a behavior. And because of differences in a person's anatomy and how they process fats and sugars and whatnot, it is almost entirely unpredictable how much weight someone will lose, regardless of the plan that they're on. So when we do that, when we say, even if we identify that as the C, I will weigh, you could, and anybody who's been on any weight management program knows they can follow it to a T. They get to the end of the week, they're looking forward to that reward, and they gained a pound. And how frustrating that is when you're focusing on these kinds of results, bad behavior planning. So they're all bad. They're all bad. As long as they're focusing on weight loss as the goal. When we have non-specific behaviors, because we're assuming a shared language and meaning associated with these things. And when we say if we have a behavior plan that says Mark will show good attitude in class, okay, maybe we could have sort of similarities in what we think that looks like, but no, there are way different kinds of attitudes. What is that? How are we gonna know when it begins and starts? What's a good attitude versus a not so good attitude? Was that a bad attitude moment? Was that a good attitude moment? That'll be a judgment call. That doesn't work either. So friendly, you're going to be fair, you're going to do good, too vague. Then there's the behavior vacuums. These are when we use the knots. And we're going to get probably, in terms of the science of this, we're going to get into this when we talk about functional analysis later in the class. And that is, but you can really apply it in an understanding of behavioral vacuum. If you take a situation like a sibling hitting another sibling, I'll just keep that as a running example here. So whatever it is, whether it's boredom, whether it's the presence of evil in their heart, whatever it is that motivates an older sibling, let's say, to beat on their younger sibling, whatever that is, okay, when you say, do not hit your brother, the individual could potentially decide not to hit. But the evil in their heart still exists, if that's what it is, or the boredom still exists. All of that motivating factor that at one point that need was met by the behavior of hitting the brother. revenge, all of it, anything that it could have been, that's still there. And it's looking for an outlet. We haven't addressed the root problem. We've eliminated, actually, from the perspective of the person who's misbehaving, we have eliminated the solution for that need, that drive that they have by saying, no, you cannot hit your brother. You want that ice cream. So what do? That energy starts to look for another way to meet those same needs. And we'll see in functional analysis that is so important to understand when we are selecting an alternative behavior to hitting. So if we can eventually work our way to understanding the core motivations, which are essentially part of the A, that someone has before they misbehave, and we can find an alternative way, a more functional way for them to still meet those needs, but in a way that's more productive. That plan will be way better than just leaving it up to them to come up with something. So that's called a behavior vacuum. All this motivation in the A to misbehave, the opportunity to deal with that in its normal way, by misbehaving, is gone, and all that motivation is looking for a way out. And we're going to trust that kid or trust that person or trust yourself to come up with something more productive. No, those plans tend to not work. And finally, related to that is the need to develop skills. So one of the reasons that an individual faced with a behavioral vacuum is in trouble is because they have a relatively small number of behavioral choices to make. Developmentally or whatever, or because experientially, and particularly in abusive situations, a child that's misbehaving but they've been abused, part of that trauma reaction is the number of responses that they have relatively small. When I'm feeling like I need to, when I'm angry, let's say, and there's very few role models that exist in their lives outside of hitting, yelling, acting out, that's all they got. They don't have some of those other more positive ways in which you can deal with anger, talking it out or taking a walk or something like that. They've never learned those skills. So they have a small repertoire. I've been trying to come up with that word all morning. They have a small repertoire of behavior choices when they're feeling a certain thing. When the A is angry and I want to hit my brother, there's hit my brother, there's yell, and there's break something. And that's all they know. So basically there's going to be no behavior plan that's going to work, because they're just going to have to rotate between those. And when they get away with one, that's the one that's going to work. So oftentimes we have to teach them the new skill that they need. So up until now, Bobby, you've always either hit your brother, screamed and yelled, or you broke something. Now we're going to add another choice. We're going to add taking a walk. Okay? And now when you're angry, you have a relatively larger repertoire of behaviors to respond to that feeling. People who are jerks, almost by definition, have small repertoires of response. They just don't, they might even know about it, but they're just not good at it. They're just not good at, and the way that they've learned to deal with that, by yelling or controlling it, has been so effective. There's not even any motivation to find a better way to resolve those things. So we see that not only as a problem in the way we describe plans, but we also see it as the reason why many negative behaviors persist over time. That, for one, they're meeting the needs, and we'll get into this. This is all functional analysis. And secondly, they don't have anything else. They don't have another way of dealing with it. Okay. So when we are defining behaviors in our plans when we are looking at defining the A, B, and C. Okay, we have to avoid all that stuff. Now, in order to avoid that stuff, you have a couple tools that I introduced to you in this class. And one is the stranger test, and one is the dead man's test. And these are a little, if you can figure out those, what it is, you take the behavior description, and if it passes both of those tests, it's probably a good behavior description. So let me define each one as simply as possible. This is not, it's a little confusing, but it's not complex. Okay? Stranger test. Stranger test means that we use behavioral descriptions that are detailed and generic enough that an individual who reads it, who has no idea who anybody is in this, will know exactly what you're talking about. So let me use, I'll use the hitting one again. Okay, so let's say you're writing the behavior plan and you want to make sure the babysitter does the behavior plan. And that's one of the motivations for the stranger test. If somebody else has to implement your behavior plan, you want to make sure that what you mean by hitting is also what they understand as hitting, and it's also what the kid knows about hitting. We have clearly defined this. Maybe we've narrowed it down, maybe we've expanded it. So, is a tap on the head hitting? Is a shove hitting? Slap on the back? Punch in the face? What if it's just like that? That could be very irritating too, but is it hitting? Does it fit that? You can see how slippery this gets. So what you do is you define your behavior in such a manner, sometimes with many words, sometimes with just a few words, and you make sure to the best of your ability that everybody's clear what we're talking about. The biggest violations that we get is when we assume, again, that there's common language. We might say, every time Billy throws a fit, counted as one of his behaviors or whatever. Like, well, what does that look like? What's a fit? Does he stamp his foot? Or does he throw himself on his back and kicking around all things? Does he break things? There's all kinds of ways that we can define that. But you write, and this is the procedure, you write out your, don't think about this stuff yet, but you write your behavior description and then test it. So you write out the behavior description and you say, could anybody who doesn't know the person, doesn't know you, could they come in and they would know when this begins and starts? When they would know that when they observe that thing, they would be able to see it. They would be able to identify when it happened. That's the stranger test. That alone will take care of a lot of your behaviors. The dead man's test, and this is the one that people kind of get a little squirrely about. The dead man's test is if a dead man can do it, it is not a good behavior description. Meaning, Billy will sit quietly in the room. Now you got to be a little creative about this, but can a dead man sit quietly in the room? Yes. Just prop them up like on Bernie's Weekend, right? Prop up the dead person and they're going to sit there quietly in the room. That means that sitting quietly in the room is not a good behavior plan. Billy will read to himself for 30 minutes. Nope. You can prop that book up, and as far as you're concerned, you don't know if that dead man's reading or not, because there's no observable part. So any behavior that's not directly observable through their actions and whatnot is not a good behavior management plan. And there are other ways to do that. I mean, if you are looking for a person to sit quietly in a room, there are ways to define that behavior. For one, particularly giving them something to do that's quiet, that necessitates that they're quiet and then you can actually observe that they're doing something. I hope you also recognize that the dead man's test will eliminate every single not behavior. Billy will not scream in class. Dead man can do that. A dead man cannot scream. The Billy will pay attention to the teacher. No, that's the other example. Billy will not fool around in class. That's a violation of both the stranger test and the dead man's test. What does fooling around mean? And a dead man cannot do it. And so therefore it fails that test. So if a dead man can do that. Sorry, a dead man can not do something. So let's get the phrasing right. I hope I didn't mess up anybody with that. So if a dead man can do it, that means it's not a good behaviors description. So what I'm going to be asking you to do in the assignments, and I give you all kinds of examples of these. Please read through those. If you have questions, if you want me to explain them, post those in the question discussion board. I'm going to be looking for that. If anybody wants a deeper explanation, let's do it there so everybody can benefit from any sort of insight that I might be able to provide on your answers. I suppose you could even post some examples in there of your own, and I can work those. But let's work those in the discussion board so that other people can benefit from that Q&A. Now, what I'm going to be asking you to do is to come up with 3 behaviors that exist that you want to get rid of. We're not going to be adding new behaviors. We're going to just say this is, for lack of better terms, bad behaviors that we want to replace with good behaviors. The terminology that we have here is we have target behaviors are the ones we're trying to get rid of, and replacement or preferred behaviors is what we're going to replace them with. So hitting your brother is the target behavior. You have to come up with an alternative to that behavior. Now, for right now, we're not looking at the functional analysis. We're not looking at the consequence. All you're doing is defining the behavior and making sure that it passes both the dead man's test and the stranger test. So your document is going to have a title page, and then you're going to have the behavior number 1. Write out, and that will be a behavior that is a target behavior. It's a behavior you want to get rid of. That has to pass the dead man's test and the stranger test as well. So if you say bad attitude, wrong, that also has to, the target behavior and the replacement behavior both have to meet that criteria. It's going to help you in defining the target behavior if you do that. So you're going to define the target behavior. You're going to define the replacement behavior, and then you're going to write a paragraph telling me why you believe, telling me why you believe the 2 statements above both meet the stranger test and the dead man test. And don't say, because it meets the test. No, tell me why. Why is it specifically? I want you to get into that thinking about why will a stranger understand this, each one, and why a dead man cannot do those things. Explain that 3 times. Let's do that 3 times on 3 different behaviors. Remember, the target behavior also needs to meet the tests, and the replacement behavior needs to meet the test. Now, in the discussion, What I want you to tell is stories about where you found your way around the rules, or basically experiences that you might have found of the behavioral vacuum, where someone said, don't do this, you found another way to meet those needs, kind of thing. And so I'll leave that to your creative journey down memory lane. That should be pretty fun to do that. I can come up with several of my own. And I may contribute some to that discussion. So we'll talk about ways in which we've worked around the rules, and basically, well, you didn't tell me to hit him. You told me not to hit him, but you didn't say anything about tripping. That kind of result. So exploring some of the ways in which not so perfect behavior management plans actually created a behavioral vacuum, and you were able to get away with something, technically speaking. Now, sometimes parents will say, too bad, you're still losing the ice cream, kind of thing. But so you didn't get away with it, but it does show a fault in the process of creating that behavior plan. We're going to see that particularly when we get to functional analysis, is that punishing behaviors that we want to get rid of is not nearly as effective as reinforcing behaviors that we want to replace those. So if you can reinforce the ones that we can replace, that is, you can do that without punishment. Sometimes there are plans that do both. The next chapter is about reinforcement and punishment. We'll be looking at the definitions of those things in our final, once we get the ABC kind of thing happening right now, talking about the B, next week talking about the C's, reinforcements and punishments are two choices there. We'll see how that all comes together. So that's it for this week. So read the chapter, look at all the examples that I have of replacement behaviors and statements that meet both the dead man's test and the stranger test, and get this assignment in. I did grade the assignment I was a week behind on. Now I'm going to be grading last week's assignment, getting into that, a quiz and an assignment from last week. And I think we should be pretty good moving on through the semester here. So have a great week. Enjoy this exploration of your past and ways that you got away with things, and coming up with those great behavior statements. Remember, I'm not looking for the A, I'm not looking for the C, just the behavior description. What would you be looking if you had to track this on a chart and count how many times that behavior happened? What are you looking for? That's what I'm looking for. Don't give the A's and C's. Don't give, we'll get an ice cream. Not interested in that right now. So just the B's. So I will see you online. Have a great week. Looks like we're going to have some good weather, and take care.